Here. So we just have to do a little, I'm just going to repeat a disclaimer I made about this book. Some of the dialogue when we are in character with the bad, the evil characters, is language that will get flagged on YouTube because YouTube doesn't understand context. And also, just on a personal note, I find some of them a little bit unpleasant to say. So there's a few, I'm really sorry to Ben Elton, I'm not trying to censor your book. There aren't like terrible words in here. There are just some distasteful words in here that because of this platform, it makes it difficult. So rather than say where the bad person in his inner dialogue calls Indigenous people ABS, like just sound that out. I'm going to say aboriginal, and I know that's not the correct word, but that's so that you know that it's in the character. Like the way he's thinking of those words is that word is very different to the way the other characters that are coming into the book. Yeah, and anyway, so this is really difficult. I don't really know how to do it, but at the same time, this is just how it is. All right, let's go. New chapter. Stark conspirator. Man with a mission. Sly had left the dinner in LA a changed man. Changed forever. He flew home to Oz, a fully committed member of the Stark conspiracy. The problem with Aboriginals. Unfortunately, with trust came responsibilities. Sly had a specific role to play, a role which he knew would not be an easy one. He had been charged with acquiring the land. The consortium had done their homework, and Western Australia was certainly far and away the best bet for the very detailed specifications necessary for their purposes. No doubt that was why Sly had been brought into the group at all. The clever bastards had already roughly picked out the bit of scrub that they wanted, which was almost convenient, except, of course, for the Aboriginals. In his efforts to ingratiate himself with his new partners, Sly had spoken glibly of simply persuading the Aboriginals to move on to greener pastures out in the back. New chapter. Stark conspirator. Man with a mission. Sly had left that dinner in LA a changed man. Changed forever. He flew home to Oz, a fully committed member of the Stark conspiracy. The problem with Aboriginals. Unfortunately, with trust came responsibilities. Sly had a specific role to play, a role which he knew would not be an easy one. He had been charged with acquiring the land. The consortium had done their homework, and Western Australia was certainly far and away the best bet for the very detailed specifications necessary for their purposes. No doubt that was why Sly had been brought into the group at all. The clever bastards had already roughly picked out the bit of scrub they wanted, which was almost convenient. Except, of course, for the Aboriginals. In his efforts to ingratiate himself with his new partners, Sly had spoken glibly of simply persuading the Aboriginals to move on to greener pastures, but in the back of his mind, he knew it would be tougher than getting red wine chunder out of a duck-down duvet. To say that Aboriginals were a strange crew would, in Sly's opinion, be stretching the well-known Aussie talent for understatement to its limits. He knew kangaroos with more horse sense than an Aboriginal. They were stubborn too, strange and stubborn. That was Aboriginals, and on no subject were they stranger and stubborner than on the subject of land. Land was an obsession with Aborigines. Of course, no one could argue with a man being attached to the place he hung his hat. Sly himself had a little spread on the Swan River that was his pride and joy. It had a swimming pool the shape of Western Australia, an outdoor cocktail bar made of glass with real fish inside it, and a genuine Henry Moore, which Sly had bought unseen and had hastily had to plant a bunch of gum trees to hide the bloody monstrosity. Beautiful land, beautifully appointed, but unlike some Aboriginals, well, he'd happily move on if he was paid enough. What was their problem? What were they protecting? Nothing. Just a load of dust and rocks and empty bottles. It wasn't what was on the land. It was the land itself. For some reason, specific bits of land had specific spiritual relevance. Sly thanked God he wasn't religious. He'd have bulldozed down Notre Dame if he thought there was half a barrel of oil underneath it. Maybe the Aboriginals have grown up, thought Sly in a brief moment of hope. Maybe they'd move after all. He'd give them good grazing country, access to a river, their own pub. But deep in his heart, which was not awfully deep, Sly knew they wouldn't. He could just see some bastard headman standing leaning on his stick, staring straight through him, chewing his gums through a huge, stupid white beard that made him look like he was Frenching a sheep. He wouldn't budge an inch. The bloody-minded old goat would fuck Sly off like he was Lord Muck with $1 million in his jeans instead of some broke old derelict with a head full of lice. These were Sly's bitter reflections as he sat in his first-class seat the morning after the dinner. It wouldn't have been so difficult a few years ago, but land rights had become a real big issue in the last decade or so. You couldn't just push people around anymore. You'd get every government-sponsored bleeding heart in the country down your back. It was ridiculous. How are you supposed to run a country for the good of all if you kept worrying about people's damn rights? Sly looked at the middle-aged hostess who was serving his champagne. Steel grey crew cut. Clearly a leso, thought Sly. That was equal rights for you. Sly could remember when air hostesses were a bunch of little spunks, every single one. They'd lean over to pour your fizz in their cute white blouses and you'd get a tiny, tantalising glimpse of the tops of their frilly little bras. Sexier than any full-on strip show, that glimpse, thought Sly, because you knew the girl had class. They'd get sacked at 28, of course, and why not? Why should people get a meal ticket for life at the expense of the consumer? He asked himself. What was a hostess for, he'd like to know? Jesus, a machine could serve the fucking drinks and microwave the chops. A hostess was there to make the flight more bearable. But now, of course, that was called sex discrimination. No sackings on ground of sex or age. These days you either got served by some boy flageolet or a middle-aged hag who never married a captain because she was a muff tucker. Oh, shit. Sorry, that one caught me off guard. All right, big love to all the muff tuckers out there. We love you, ladies. All right. The only way to get a decent floor show was to fly a Far Eastern airline like Malaya or Singapore. Beautiful girls, but could you trust the pilot? It wasn't that he was an ogre or anything like that, Sly assured himself. He'd never been a perv. No way. It was just nice to look at pretty young girls. Well, everyone knew that. So why couldn't these damn do-gooders just admit it? Ugh. He wished he'd used his private jet. Sly was getting pissed and working himself into a frenzy because he knew that what he had promised in Los Angeles would be very difficult to deliver. He just fervently hoped that when he headed north to scout around, the Aboriginals he'd have to deal with would not be the spiritual type and would like to drink. New chapter. Whew. The collapse of a dream. Excuse me. Just wetting my whistle. Sly may have been feeling bitter, but CD thought he was going to die. He was discovering that there are worse feelings than just being in love. There is something horribly worse, much worse than he ever could have imagined. Unrequited love. Two of the saddest words in the English language had laid CD as low as sure as if they'd been written on a brick and he'd been hit over the head with it. The shock of learning how much he was capable of feeling, it made him scared and angry. He had always presumed that he was a fairly shallow sort of a person, not want to feel either joy or sorrow to any great degree. And now he discovered that he was at the mercy of feelings way, way beyond his control. It was very confusing. He felt impotent, awash with emotions so palpable that they seemed to have an actual physical form. The feeling that had dwelt in his guts for the last few weeks now seemed feather-light and gentle compared to the large piece of lead that had somehow managed to insert itself into his abdomen whilst he wasn't looking. Because she wasn't interested. No, it wasn't anything to do with that Karen woman, Rachel had assured him in answer to his desperate protests, or any of the other people he had introduced her to. It was simply that she didn't feel that way about CD. Also, she had no idea that he felt that way about her either. She felt that they'd just become very good friends, which was great. And that was just the way she wanted it. There was certainly no question of anything else, just friends, that was all. I'm sorry, Rachel. I can't deal with that. It would be too much, CD had said with dignity. Just friends? What a suggestion! What an insult to the strength of his feelings! Didn't she understand just how much he loved her? Just friends? What did she think he was? You can't feel the things he was feeling and settle for just friends. I'm an all-or-nothing sort of person, he had said, looking at her with what he thought was an expression of boundless sorrow. Me and half measures, never did get along. The eyes misty now, staring at hers with unrelenting frankness. In his anguish, CD failed to recall that this trick did not work for Karen the hippie and was unlikely to work for him. I have to have it all, he added, switching his look to lean and handsome. Rachel said, "Oh, that's a shame, Colin. Oh, well, I suppose that's it then." Well, that was a surprise. One of the most irritating features of unrequited love is that hope springs eternal. CD had rather been hoping that Rachel would say, "Oh, well, in that case, do you want me now, or shall we wait till we can find a bed?" Summoning up all of his dignity, which at that point took about a picosecond, CD rose to leave. "I'm sorry, Rachel. I'm out of here. Yesterday's news. Maybe I'll travel. Don't look for me tomorrow, baby, 'cause I'll be gone." "What about the casserole dish?" "Keep it." He slung his pretend leather satchel. "What about the casserole dish?" "Keep it." He slung his pretend leather jacket over his shoulder. "It's mine? You've got it at your house?" In a magnificent gesture, CD walked out without a word, returning a few minutes later with a brand new casserole dish. "See you," said Rachel. "Yeah, maybe," CD replied with another portion of boundless sorrow. And this time he really did leave, walked out magnificently. He stood on the pavement in his torn jeans and burst into tears. Hero. He had no right to resent Rachel for not falling in love with him. Well, he knew that, but by God he did. And as he walked home, his anguish assumed ever more heroic proportions. He was magnificent in his loneliness. He could do anything now because he no longer cared. There was no greater force than a man with nothing to lose, CD told himself. He could achieve great things because all his achievements would mean nothing to him. Nothing because he was nothing, and nothing comes of nothing. And when he had done all these great things and returned, tired or dead, the fruits of his terrible solitude spread about him for all to see, well, then she would be sorry. Then she would realise what she had passed up. Then she would weep and wish that things had been different. But he would just smile at her, presuming he was still alive, that is, smile at her with infinite weariness etched in the lines of his lean, craggy face, and then turn away without a word. No, wait, maybe he would say, well, something brilliant about fucking casserole dishes anyway. But for now, it was definitely over. He had told her that was it. He had walked out of her life forever, and he was going to stick to that. He would never speak to her again. That was the only way. He knew it was the only way. Hope springs eternal. Hi, Rachel, your friend and main man CD here, calling to you. It was evening, hours after he had left her at the cafe with the casserole dish. Not that he had held out that long. He'd been trying since about 3 minutes after he'd got home, but she'd been out. Oh, hi, Colin. I wondered if you'd phone. I had to go to Mum's. Promised to help her with the garden. This was scarcely the hours of anguished pacing along pavements made strangely unfamiliar by her new isolation, which was what CD had rather hoped Rachel had been up to, but there you go. He wasn't quibbling. He'd recovered slightly. Hope springs eternal. Listen, I was just wondering if we could still be, like what we are at the moment, just that. But of course, that's what I want, Colin, replied Rachel. As long as you know what I meant, as long as you know that I meant what I said, I really did, and I do. Oh, yeah, of course, forget it, no problem, won't mention it again, said CD. It'll be exactly the same as it was. Great, said Rachel, knowing that it would never be the same again. Actually, although neither Rachel nor CD knew it, nothing was ever going to be the same again. Nothing in the whole world. It was only early on in the northern summer, but already it was very, very hot, much hotter than usual. The times were definitely a-changing. It was definitely very, very hot. New chapter. On the business of Stark. Sly piloted his own 4-seater light aircraft out of Perth and headed northeast, up towards the Territory. It was a flight he normally enjoyed hugely. The place was so utterly enormous. Oh, what a sight. It was what flying must have been like in the very early days when you had the whole sky to yourself and could dodge and weave as you felt like it. These days, it was like playing Space Invaders with air traffic control. It wasn't flying, circling high in the stack, waiting in line to put down in a blanket of smog so thick you couldn't see the landing lights, petrified to drop or rise by the width of a credit card because you'd probably get a jumbo in the face. Those passengers on the right of the plane should get a good view of the mountains, and those on the left should just be able to make out a 747 full of terrified people pointing at you and screaming, "Get the fuck out of the way!" Sly would not personally fly himself anywhere these days except over Oz. Maybe Africa would be all right, but Sly wasn't going to Africa if he could help it. As far as he could see, the third world was getting thirder. Soon they would have to start calling it the fourth world, maybe the fifth, a continent full of poverty. What would be the point of going there? Poor bastards. Actually, as he sat at the controls of his little plane, Sly was on a journey into poverty, on the business of Stark. He was going to chat with some Aboriginals, and you don't get much poorer than your average Aboriginal. That's why most people hate them, thought Sly. They're so horribly poor. It gets on your nerves. Why do they have to hang around all the time, being so poor? Why don't they just fuck off and be poor somewhere else? Lots of Aboriginals end up pissheads, causing people to say, no wonder they're so poor, half of them are pissheads. It would, of course, make much more sense to say, well, no wonder half of them are pissheads. They're so poor. Australia is guilt-ridden by Aboriginal history, and people get nasty when they feel guilty. They seek to find a scapegoat, and they often end up blaming the victims themselves. Jesus, mate, they're fucking rolling in it. Christ, the government's so fucking wet it just spoon-feeds some handouts and they piss the lot up against the wall. This, of course, is the way people deal with degradation the whole world over. Sympathy for victims is always counterbalanced by an equal and opposite feeling of resentment towards them. How often Sly had said, "See that tramp? Wanted money for a meal. I gave him $1, of course. Probably earns more than I do. Probably got a fortune stuffed under his mattress." Sly never asked himself why someone with a fortune stuffed under his mattress would choose to sit in a gutter all day. Paradise Lost. Sly was flying over Kalgoorlie. They dug uranium there, and Sly had a lot of money in it. It had been a hell of a battle to get the government to give the go-ahead. People were such a bunch of old women when it came to nuclear energy. It had cost the earth to prove how safe it was. Dinners, parties, donations, all expenses paid, fact-finding, luxury trips. Those high-minded political types did not sell themselves cheaply. All Sly and his colleagues wanted was a tiny, tiny relaxation in the frankly impractical laws on how much uranium was produced. Also, it would be nice if there were less restrictions on who they were allowed to sell it to. And finally, it would make life easier if they did not have to ask so many embarrassing and impertinent questions as to what the buyer wanted it for. Just a small rationalisation of these absurdly restrictive laws would net $10 billion a year, which would, of course, generate some very juicy corporate tax, not to mention the gerbs. Besides this, the consortium agreed, you cannot stop progress. And if they didn't do it, someone else would. The Canadians were already doing it, in fact. Yes, that had shocked those bastard greenies. Canada, land of the maple leaf and acid rain protest, was flogging uranium off the back of a barrow just about to... Yes, that had shocked those bastard greenies. Canada, land of the maple leaf and acid rain protest, was flogging uranium off the back of a barrow to just about any piss-poor potential terrorist base of a country that could afford it. Sly's mining consortium hadn't gotten everything it had wanted, but it had got enough, and Kalgoorlie was by way of being a bit of a boom town. It was dangerous work, and it certainly screwed up the land a bit, but you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. Lots and lots of eggs. What a mess it was. Until he flew over it, Sly had never realised just how hellish a few hundred hectares of virtually unrestricted mining could look. It was a couple of years since he and the other members of the consortium had stood on the pretty hillside with the champagne and the photographers, bleating on about it being a great day for Australia. Since then, a good approximation of Hades had been produced. The land was scarred and smashed and poisoned. And soon it would also be empty. And when that happened, Sly and his friends would fence it in and move on. Or land. Land was there to be used. The desert oak. A couple of 100 years before the mines were laid, an Aboriginal man had used the land himself. He was on walkabout and thirsty. Aboriginals were often thirsty. This comes from living in an enormous desert. The fellow in question was thirsty, but he was cool. He was cool because he knew that all he needed to do was find a desert oak tree. It wasn't called a desert oak tree in those days, of course. What the Aboriginal in question called it, one can only guess at. Possibly sir, or perhaps darling. Something appreciative, certainly, because this tree was going to save his life. Well, you wouldn't have thought of it as a lifesaver, not to look at it, certainly. No one, not even its mother, could have called it an inspiring or handsome tree. The desert oak was, and in fact still is, as a breed, a hugely unimpressive, scrappy, crappy little tree. Even its best friends would say so. Tree, they would say, realising that you have to be cruel to be kind, do not go entering yourself into any horticultural shows. You'll only embarrass us all. But the desert oak can smile knowingly to itself. It has a secret. Because although on the surface it may be just a 6-foot skinny streak of fibre with about 10 leaves to its name, beneath the desert floor it is a very different story. For the desert oak can put down roots as deep as 300 feet. In fact, as far as needs be to reach water. Let there be no question about it. Ugly as fuck though it is, root-wise the desert oak does not mess around. Still waters run deep, and so do desert oaks. Other factors that make this tree remarkably together, as far as living in the desert goes, include its ability to die at will. When times are hard, and let's face it, they almost always are for a tree in a desert, the top bit of the tree just switches off, drops its leaves, shrivels up, and pretends to be dead. You wouldn't notice the change to look at it, of course. So unimpressive is the desert oak in full bloom that the difference between it stretching its branches and saying, "God, it's good to be alive in a tree today," and it pretending to be dead is not marked. In fact, the two states are almost identical. Nonetheless, that is what it does. On the surface, the tree dies. Underneath, though, the search for water goes on, and when that water is found, after what could be as much as 15 or 20 years, the top bit comes back to life and blossoms in its full patheticness. Possibly conscious of the trouble it has gone to find water, once found, the desert oak makes the most of it. It stores it, sucking up as much as it can up through its 300-foot roots and storing a few pints in its horrid, spindly little trunk. And this is where the thirsty Aborigine comes in, because the Aborigines have always known about these trees. They had worked out a way to get at that water without the tedious necessity of having to put down 300-foot roots and pretend to be dead for 20 years themselves. And what they used to do was this. They would make a little hole in the bark of the tree and put a twig in. And then they would sit under the tree, under the twig, with their mouths open and wait for the water to drip in. And this is what our man did hundreds of years ago on the site of what was to become the overmined, useless uranium plant. And once he had drunk enough, he didn't just get up and piss off, leaving the tree to drip until it died. No. He removed the twig, got a bit of gum from the bark of a nearby eucalyptus and bunged up the hole he'd made. This was the way it was done. You plugged up your hole. The Aborigines were a Stone Age society, one of the most primitive on Earth. They'd not even developed a simple television game show. But they knew that if you looked after the environment, well, there was a good chance it would look after you. Now, Sly and his friends had taken what they wanted from the land, just as the Aboriginal had done. But they had no intention of bunging up their hole. Too expensive. Too much trouble. The term primitive is clearly a highly subjective one.